think until we have access to broader arrays of services, whether that's through broadband in rural areas or better cell coverage than we have in the state of Wyoming, I can tell you, having driven across the state, that we don't have the best cell coverage in this state. So we have to continue to rely on landlines, which means in a lot of our rural communities we cannot deregulate them. We would have to continue to guarantee service, and I would certainly want to work with our providers to make sure that we can deregulate in the cities, but not in the rural areas. I think, again, we need to expand broadband and make sure that it's available across the board and in rural communities. We need to look into our 911 coverage and also make sure that we have all of those public safety features in place, not just for our rural citizens, but for everyone in Wyoming.
Well, as you know, telecommunications is somewhat regulated by our Public Service Commission. And now with the advent of technology, on the government side, we can monitor services and we also can deal with complaints. So where there's a monopoly involved, the government can have a lot of influence on being sure this service is reliable and affordable. Fortunately, coming down the pike, as we get away from landlines, which some of our people are stuck with, there are technologies that will be much more reliable than satellite and much more affordable than satellite. But in the interim, government has to keep an eye out for complaints and for loss of services, especially in remote areas.
It's interesting that you asked me that question, as I grew up out in the country, and there were many years when I was growing up that we did not have phone service at all. Later, after we got a telephone, we actually had a party line, and which also limited the amount of services that you had. I fully understand the importance of having affordable and reliable service. My 95-year-old mother, in fact, still lives on the ranch and only has a landline. So it is critically important that folks like her have the ability to have a phone for the services that you've described for me earlier. I also have been traveling extensively over the last 6 months, over 30,000 miles now, and there are large areas of Wyoming where we don't have any cell phone coverage. Again, I believe that it is important that we have reliable cell phone coverage throughout the entire state of Wyoming. I am committed to working with the companies to make sure that we not only protect and preserve those landlines for folks like my mother, but I'm also committed to working with the companies to ensure that we can expand cell phone service throughout the state. So it is something that is important. It's important for our future in Wyoming.
Well, Wyoming benefits currently from having a pretty robust wired network. And in this rural community where sometimes it's difficult to get cell phone coverage, which we hope will improve as those services are built out, it's important that we maintain that wired service so that seniors, veterans, and others can access phones reliably and understandably. And so I think it's important that we maintain that wired system. I would work as the governor to make sure that the transition we have to these newer technologies makes sense. I myself had a recent experience with my father who was unable to understand exactly how to use his cell phone, but because he had a familiarity with the wired phone service, he was able to get through to us. It's important that we have that service.
Well, I live rurally, and so do my folks. And it's become abundantly clear to me that we're not quite prepared in this state to transition from a hardline telephone world to a wireless and satellite world. We have a lot of work to do in this regard. And so everybody could count on me to keep close tabs on where we're at in this area, and I would not want to be a proponent of doing any type of transition where our phone companies are allowed to cut hardline service to our rural residents until the time that we know that we're prepared as a state to take advantage of the new technology in wireless and broadband and fiber. Right now, Wyoming ranks 48th in this regard. We have a lot of work to do.
I believe we're at a somewhat disadvantage being so spread out and such smaller states, so the ability to put up towers for cell phone service is more challenging. So I believe we should keep the existing structure in place until we get the broadband and the other capacities for cell phones to expand. And that's a very important part of the communications effort that we have to maintain.
Well, first of all, if there is not any competition, a form of regulation has to be in place to keep the cost in check in rural areas. I actually have landline at my place because cell phone range is not adequate where I live. I live in the country outside of Sheridan, Wyoming. And so I depend on the landline for service. Until technology proves otherwise or competition proves otherwise, regulation is probably necessary if there is no competition. So I think it's especially with the healthcare future of telehealth coming on in the future for people in rural areas.
Well, the industry has evolved from 2002. I was up in Riverton, Wyoming, as the first time I ever ran for governor candidate, and I heard Verizon, AT&T, and everybody else asking the state of Wyoming for access along the right-of-ways to get their trunk lines in. Well, we allowed them to do that. However, while they were in that conference, I asked them one question. What about the elderly? What about the kids who can't pay for their phone bills? What about them people? They kind of looked at me like, huh? Because basically that's the problem. Long distance phone calling wasn't being reduced in wages or anything else at that time period. 16 years later, we got the same problem. And I don't care what they say. Their trunk lines are along the interstate. They've got all that stuff. But we need trunk lines to come out. We need trunk lines to go into the smaller communities where the elderly are gathering.